Grant Hollis left town for 7 days. When he returned, his house was gone, not damaged, gone. Crushed to rubble by the woman who ran his homeowners association under a demolition permit bearing a signature that wasn't his. A clubhouse sign already stood staked into the dirt where his living room used to be. Marla Voss assumed silence would bury the truth along with the house. She assumed wrong. Grant had cameras she never found, and a boundary map proving she had no right to touch his land at all. What he uncovered next would expose forged signatures, a stolen fortune, and a judge who was about to make her pay for every single stone. Grant Hollis owned a stone and timber house on nearly 6 acres at the edge of the Silver Ridge community, a property built decades earlier, and rebuilt board by board and stone by stone through his own hands as a structural engineer who understood exactly how a house should be made to last. The house had stood on that hilltop long before the Homeowners Association ever existed, and the county records were unambiguous about it. His deed placed the boundary of Silver Ridge more than 200 feet from his property line, and although the shared road happened to pass through association land, an easement for travel had never once been mistaken for an ownership, claimed not by any surveyor, not by any court, and certainly not by Grant himself. Marla Voss was 52 years old, and had spent nearly a decade turning the presidency of a modest homeowners association into something closer to a personal fiefdom, collecting favors, controlling contracts, and quietly building relationships with vendors who depended on her approval to keep their business. She had arrived in Silver Ridge, with ambitions far larger than the neighborhood itself, and those who worked closely with her often said she treated every meeting, every vote, and every dollar in the reserve account as a stepping stone towards something bigger she never quite named out loud. Marla Voss refused to accept that distinction. For months she had buried Grant in baseless notices, fining him over the color of his roof, demanding he tear down a stone gate that predated the association by a generation, ordering him to move a work truck parked entirely on his own land, and even insisting on the right to inspect the interior of a home she had no legal claim over. She billed him for association dues he had never agreed to pay. Grant answered every letter the same calm way, with deeds, plat maps, and polite refusals that never gave her the confrontation she seemed to want. His composure, rather than settling the matter, only convinced Marla that he was the one obstacle standing between her and total control of the hill. Other residents had learned long ago not to challenge Marla directly, since anyone who questioned her judgment tended to find their landscaping, cited their parking privileges, revoked, or their renovation permits mysteriously delayed for months at a time. She had built her reputation over 8 years as association president by rewarding loyalty and punishing resistance in equal measure, and most of Silver Ridge had simply learned to nod along rather than risk becoming her next target. Grant's refusal to bend was therefore something new to her, a kind of resistance that money and threats alone couldn't seem to break, and it grated on her far more than any actual rule violation ever could have. That control had a price tag attached to it. The association had unveiled ambitious plans for a members-only clubhouse, complete with a restaurant, a conference hall, and a viewing terrace overlooking the valley, and the most desirable site for such a project was unmistakably the hilltop where Grant's house already stood. Marla offered to buy him out for a fraction of what the land and the home were worth, and when Grant declined without hesitation, something in her calculation shifted from persuasion to elimination. She began speaking about the property, not as something she wanted to purchase, but as something she intended to simply take, as though ownership were a matter of will rather than law. Grant was 45 years old, quiet by nature, and known throughout his profession for a kind of patience that made him excellent at his job and nearly impossible to provoke. He had bought the hilltop property more than a decade earlier, when the stone farmhouse sitting on it was little more than a shell with a collapsed roof and a foundation nobody else wanted to touch. Over the years that followed, he had replaced every beam himself, reset every stone by hand, and installed systems built to outlast him, treating the house less like an investment and more like an ongoing conversation between himself and the land it stood on. Neighbors who had known him the longest described him the same way, a man who kept to himself, waved from his truck, and never once raised his voice, even when Marla's letters grew increasingly absurd. A week before Grant left for a scheduled bridge inspection that would keep him out of town for 7 days, Marla appeared uninvited at his gate. She told him the house was the last blemish standing in the way of Silver Ridge, becoming the finest address in the county, and she made it plain that patience was no longer part of her plan. Grant warned her evenly, and without raising his voice, that she had no authority to set foot on his land, let alone alter a single stone of it. Marla only smiled and delivered a line that would replay in his mind for weeks afterward, telling him that by the time he returned, the problem might simply no longer exist. Grant assumed it was nothing more than pressure tactics meant to force a sale, but caution was second nature to a man who built his career catching small failures before they became catastrophic ones. Before he left, he verified that his security cameras were recording properly, confirmed that footage was being mirrored automatically to an off-site server, and sent his attorney, Tessa Caldwell, a fresh copy of every land record tied to the property. Then he drove to the airport Monday morning to begin an inspection contract on a highway bridge several states away, with no way of knowing that within hours of his departure, Marla had already called an emergency closed-door session of WO Batter, the Homeowners Association Board. In that private meeting, Marla told the board members that an urgent inspection had determined Grant's house posed an immediate structural danger to the community, though nobody in the room had actually seen the inspection report itself. Only a one-page summary bearing a signature, none of them recognized. Celeste Barron, the association's treasurer, grew visibly uneasy when she learned the demolition would be funded straight out of the community's reserve account, but Marla reassured her that once the land was cleared, the association would simply claim it and issue bonds to finance the clubhouse construction. A few board members pointed out reasonably that Grant had never signed any agreement to join the association in the first place, and Marla countered by producing what she called a boundary addendum, proving otherwise a document manufactured only 3 days earlier and never filed with the county. Alongside the fake addendum, Marla had also drafted a fraudulent violation order claiming Grant failed to respond within 90 days, complete with a signature meant to pass as his own, but bearing none of his actual handwriting. When the paperwork reached Judith Crane, the city clerk responsible for permits, she noticed the application was missing. A full engineering report contained no photographs, proving any danger, listed a parcel number that didn't match the property address, and had clearly been backdated. Judith refused to stamp it until Marla reminded her in a tone that left little room for misunderstanding that Judith's husband ran a maintenance business whose contracts depended entirely on Silver Ridge's continued goodwill. Under that pressure, Judith stamped only a temporary receipt acknowledging the paperwork had been submitted, careful to preserve the emails and a recorded phone call that documented exactly how the threat had been made. Marla then hired Wade Mercer, owner of a local demolition company, telling him the house had already been condemned by court order due to imminent collapse. When Wade asked to see the actual ruling, Marla handed him a document titled An Emergency Abatement Authorization, official looking enough to pass a glance but missing any court case number whatsoever. His doubts lingered until Marla offered an extra 40% on top of his fee if the job could be finished before the homeowner returned from his trip, and Greed did what her paperwork could not. By Wednesday morning, excavators, bulldozers, and debris trucks were climbing the hill road toward Grant's property, their diesel engines echoing across a neighborhood that had never seen heavy machinery on that stretch of road before. A neighbor named Dean Rutledge saw the convoy and asked what was happening, and Marla told him without hesitation that the house was about to collapse and that the owner had already agreed to its demolition, a lie captured in full by Grant's exterior cameras. Dean later admitted he had felt a flicker of doubt watching the trucks pass, since the house had never looked anything less than solid to him. But Marla's confidence was persuasive enough that he simply went back inside and thought little more of it that morning. The demolition crew cut the lock on the gate, drove straight onto the land, and began tearing into the roofline within the hour, unaware that a silent alarm had already fired off an automated notification to Grant's phone the moment the first structural wall was breached, a warning that arrived at a bridge site with no cell signal sitting untouched inside a locked equipment case nearly 400 miles away. Wade Mercer had instructed his crew to demolish only the sections marked on the paperwork he'd been given, but Marla stood at the edge of the property and pointed at the entire house, ordering the whole structure leveled without exception. The crew tore through the hand-restored stone living room, the workshop where Grant kept decades of specialized tools, the backup solar battery system that powered the property, a private library holding family records and original blueprints, the garage sheltering 2 vintage automobiles, the well and irrigation lines beneath the yard, and finally the stone perimeter wall. Grant had rebuilt himself one section at a time. Because several structural details in the house were unique to Grant's own design work, rebuilding it later would demand rare materials, specialized craftsmen, and drawings that existed almost nowhere else. Midway through the destruction, one worker discovered a fireproof safe bolted beneath the floor of the study, and Wade ordered the machinery stopped long enough to protect it as personal property. Marla immediately declared that everything inside the house had already been seized by the association over unpaid management fees and had the safe loaded onto a private vehicle before anyone could object. An act captured cleanly by an exterior camera, along with the license plate and the exact time of the theft. It was around this moment that Wade began to suspect he had been used and quietly started photographing every document Marla handed him while saving her text messages, pushing the crew to work faster. He had run his demolition company for nearly 20 years without ever once being asked to level an entire home on the word of a homeowners association alone, and the unease sitting in his stomach only grew heavier as the day wore on. More than once he considered stopping the crew entirely and demanding real paperwork before continuing, but the extra money Marla had promised, along with her repeated insistence that the matter was already settled through the courts, kept him moving forward against his own better judgment. By Thursday evening, the house that had taken years to restore was nothing but a field of broken stone. Marla had trucks haul away most of the salvageable materials that same night, in direct violation of rules requiring an inventory before any residential structure could be cleared. And by Friday morning, a large sign had been staked into the Prassiclee, cleared earth, announcing the future site of the Silver Ridge Summit Club. She brought in an architecture firm to walk the property and mark locations for an infinity pool, a wedding pavilion, and an expanded parking area, behavior that made her true motive impossible to disguise any longer, since nobody who genuinely believed a home posed a collapse risk would already be planning the venue that would replace it. To cover her tracks, Marla directed Celeste to funnel $380,000 from the Community Reserve Fund into a newly formed consulting company, one fronted by a distant cousin of Marla's who had no staff, no office, and no actual business operations. The transfers were disguised across several invoices labeled as safety consulting, hazardous material, handling emergency management, boundary surveying, and special administrative fees. A paper trail engineered to look routine to anyone who never bothered to look closely. By Sunday night, the demolition crew had packed up and gone, and Marla stood alone on the cleared hilltop, certain that with the house destroyed, whatever evidence Grant might have used against her had been buried along with it, never once. Suspecting that the footage from every camera on the property had already been mirrored somewhere far beyond her reach. Grant's flight landed early Monday morning, and as he drove the familiar road toward home, he spotted the clubhouse advertisement staked into the earth before he ever registered that the house behind it was simply gone. He stopped the car in the middle of the road, unable at first to process the scene in front of him. The shattered stone gate, the felled trees, the bare foundation exposed to open sky where a home had stood for years. Walking through the debris, he recognized fragments of his former life, scattered across the dirt, a steel bar from his workbench, the shattered face of a wall clock, the twisted frame of one of his classic cars, stones pulled from the fireplace he had rebuilt with his own hands, and the crushed remains of the well piping running beneath what used to be his yard. Grant did not shout, and he did not touch anything that might disturb the scene, even as the instinct to do so pulled at him harder than anything he had felt in years. He had spent his career trained to look past emotion and focus on evidence, on load points and failure patterns and the cold, unforgiving logic of cause and effect, and he forced that same discipline onto himself, now standing in the ruins of Lode, a home he had built with his own hands. Instead, he pulled out his phone, began recording every angle of the wreckage, and carefully noted the date and time on each clip, working the scene, the way he would have worked a collapsed structure on any other job site, methodically, silently, and without a single wasted motion. Marla arrived shortly afterward with 2 association security guards in tow, walking toward him with the same confident posture she wore whenever she believed she had already won, and handed him a folder claiming the house had been demolished under an emergency court order. When Grant asked her plainly who had actually inspected the structure before condemning it, she offered no direct answer, and instead told him he had 48 hours to sign over the land to the association, promising in exchange to forgive an invented debt and pay him $175,000, a fraction of what the home and property were genuinely worth. Grant asked to see the court order itself, and Marla produced only the demolition permit, which took him mere seconds to dismantle. The parcel number belonged to a warehouse miles away. The signature attributed to him bore no resemblance to his own. The approval seal had already expired. There was no case number tying it to any actual court proceeding, and the listed inspection date fell squarely on a day he could prove he was attending an out-of-state conference. Grant told her, without raising his voice, that she hadn't demolished a dangerous structure. She had destroyed his home in order to take his land, and Marla answered that no one would ever be able to prove her true motive before ordering her guards to remove him from what she called community property. Grant pointed to the boundary marker still standing undisturbed at the property line and reminded her that she was the one trespassing, not him. After she left, he called the county sheriff and then Tessa Caldwell, careful not to disturb the wreckage any further so the evidence would remain intact for whoever investigated next. Tessa arrived within hours and advised him firmly against any further confrontation with the association, and above all warned him never to sign a single document they offered, no matter how the number attached to it might tempt him. Together, they built a list of evidence to preserve immediately: the camera archive, the land deed, the original house blueprints, renovation records, every letter the association had ever sent, insurance documentation, and every message in which Marla had made her intentions clear. When Grant logged into his server, the footage confirmed everything, the entire demolition process. Marla's own words caught on camera, and the theft of the safe loaded directly onto her vehicle. Tessa recognized immediately that this was no longer a simple property dispute, but a case shaped by forgery, theft, organized trespass, and very likely embezzlement from the association's own funds. She explained to Grant that cases like this were rarely won through outrage, no matter how justified that outrage might be, and that the strongest path forward would be a slow, methodical accumulation of documentation, strong enough that no judge or jury could dismiss it as a misunderstanding. Her plan called for 3 parallel tracks, securing an emergency order to freeze any further action on the land, building a paper trail proving the demolition had been planned and profitable rather than accidental, and identifying every witness inside the association who might be persuaded to tell the truth, once they understood the legal exposure they were facing themselves. In the final clip Grant reviewed that night, Marla stood squarely in frame and told Celeste with unmistakable certainty that they would own the hill before Hollis ever managed to find a lawyer, a sentence that would follow her all the way into a courtroom. Tessa moved quickly, filing for an emergency injunction that would bar the association from continuing construction or transferring any interest in the property, and the court granted it without delay. Once Grant presented his deed alongside the demolition footage, Marla kept telling residents at every opportunity that Grant was attempting to extort the community, insisting the association had merely prevented a dangerous structure from collapsing on someone. Tessa set out methodically to dismantle each lie one at a time, starting with a visit to Nolan Price, the surveyor who had mapped Silver Ridge's original boundaries when the association was first formed, and who still kept the county-certified map proving the association line stopped more than 200 feet short of Grant's property. That original survey confirmed everything Grant had claimed from the beginning, that the shared road created only a rite of passage and no ownership interest whatsoever, that Grant had never signed a single association agreement, and that Silver Ridge had once attempted to expand its boundary years earlier, only to be formally denied by the county, a decision Marla had been informed of in writing at the time. Nolan still had an email in which Marla had asked whether the boundary map could quietly be redrawn once the house was no longer standing, a question that left little doubt about premeditation. Tessa next reached out to Wade Mercer, who feared prosecution for his role in the demolition, but agreed to cooperate fully once he understood the alternative, and turned over every message Marla had sent him during the job. One message stood out above the rest, in which Marla had instructed Wade not to leave anything intact enough for Hollis to move back into, followed by explicit orders to destroy the well, the power lines, and the gate, so that rebuilding would be as difficult as possible. Wade admitted under questioning that Marla had pushed relentlessly to finish before Monday morning, proof that she had known exactly when Grant was scheduled to return. Judith Crane came forward next, handing over her recorded call in which Marla threatened her husband's business contracts and clarifying that the stamp she had applied only acknowledged receipt of paperwork, never approval, a distinction Marla had conveniently erased when copying the document for her own files. As Tessa and Grant dug deeper into the association's financial records, they uncovered demolition expenses that had never received legitimate board approval, along with signatures from 2 board members that showed clear signs of digital duplication. Celeste Barron had authorized several of the transfers herself, but the accompanying approvals from other members had plainly been forged. Tessa petitioned the court for a forensic accountant and demanded the association surrender its complete financial records, and Marla responded by quietly deleting internal emails and swapping out hard drives in the association office, unaware that cloud storage had already preserved a full activity history beyond her reach. Investigators eventually recovered an email Marla had sent to her chosen architect 3 weeks before the demolition, instructing him to design the clubhouse to fit precisely onto the existing foundation, since the house standing there would not remain by the time construction began. The forensic audit revealed that the clubhouse was never simply about raising property values across the neighborhood. Marla had quietly formed a real estate development company called Summit Crest Holdings, which stood to secure a 30-year management contract for the clubhouse once it was built. She kept her name off the paperwork, directly hiding behind a trust that made her the ultimate beneficiary of every dollar the project generated. From management fees and event bookings, to restaurant leases, construction commissions, premium membership dues, and the rising value of nearby land she had secretly acquired herself. Records showed the trust behind Summit Crest Holdings had been established less than a year earlier, funded initially with a modest sum that grew steadily larger as association contracts began flowing toward it under vague administrative descriptions. Marla had structured the arrangement carefully enough that a casual review of the books would show nothing more than a reasonable vendor relationship, and only a determined forensic accountant tracing every dollar back to its true origin could expose how completely she stood to benefit from a project built on land she had no legal right to touch. Grant finally understood that his home had never been destroyed out of simple spite, but as the opening move in a calculated scheme built entirely around profit. Investigator Ross Whitaker had spent nearly 2 decades working financial crimes before transferring into property fraud, and he approached the Silver Ridge case the same way he approached every other one, by following the money rather than the excuses. He cross-referenced every invoice Celeste had flagged against actual vendor registrations, quickly confirming that several of the companies receiving payments from the Association Reserve Fund existed only on paper with no employees, no physical office, and no history of performing any real work for anyone. Ross began examining the forged records and the theft of the safe in earnest, and a search warrant executed on the association's storage facility turned up a portion of Grant's belongings. Stolen ownership records the bronze, address markers from his gate, specialized tools, a box of documents, pulled from inside the safe the original forged boundary addendum, and a duplicated stamp from the city clerk's office. The safe itself was missing, but vehicle tracking data placed it at a warehouse leased under the name of Summit Crest Holdings, where investigators eventually found it forced open several items still inside, but several ownership certificates gone entirely. Grant explained that the safe had once held original blueprints, material certifications, and renovation records, along with a handful of possessions that carried no price tag but meant everything to him personally. What remained helped him prove that rebuilding the house properly would cost far more than any standard insurance payout, since several of the original stone and timber materials were no longer produced in the modern market. Meanwhile, residents throughout Silver Ridge grew increasingly uneasy after learning that $380,000 had vanished from their reserve fund, and many who had once trusted Marla completely began demanding to see the Priblance Association's meeting records for themselves. At a packed community meeting held in the clubhouse of a neighboring development, since Silver Ridge had no hall of its own left standing, residents crowded into folding chairs whispering about the missing reserve funds and the lawsuit that had suddenly put their community in the local news. Marla stood at the front of the room in a tailored blazer, projecting the same unshaken confidence she always had, and continued blaming Grant, warning residents that his lawsuit could force every household to absorb tens of thousands of dollars in additional fees. Grant appeared alongside Tessa but chose not to argue, simply presenting the original survey map and playing the recorded footage of Marla ordering the demolition herself. The room fell into stunned silence as they watched Marla declare on camera that the association would own the hill before Grant ever found representation. It was in that same silence that Celeste Barron rose from her seat, admitting publicly that Marla had pressured her into moving the funds and threatened to make her the sole scapegoat if the plan ever collapsed, and offering from that point forward to cooperate, fully handing over account passwords and a private ledger she had kept on her own. Inside that ledger, investigators found a handwritten note in Marla's own hand that laid out her true math in stark terms, capping any settlement to Grant at $250,000 against a projected profit of $14,600,000 once the acquisition was complete. With the evidence stacking against her, Marla hired a crisis communications firm out of a neighboring city, paying a substantial retainer out of association funds without board approval, and pushed a story claiming Grant had allowed his home to fall into dangerous disrepair, then exploited the association to claim damages he never deserved. The firm placed quotes with local outlets, drafted talking points for board members loyal to Marla, and even suggested Grant might be staging his outrage for financial gain, a narrative that briefly gained traction among residents who hadn't yet seen the camera footage for themselves. A fabricated structural report soon surfaced, insisting the foundation had already been badly cracked, before demolition carrying the signature of an engineer who, once contacted, directly confirmed he had retired years earlier and had never inspected the property at all. Shortly afterward, a small fire broke out at the temporary storage unit where Wade Mercer kept his files, though he had fortunately already backed up everything elsewhere. Ross suspected the fire was meant to destroy evidence, though nothing yet tied Marla to it directly. Still hoping to buy her way out, Marla raised her settlement offer to $1,200,000 on the condition that Grant surrender to all claim to the hilltop, keep the entire matter confidential, drop his request for a financial audit of the association, refused to cooperate with investigators, and publicly described the demolition as nothing more than an administrative misunderstanding. Grant refused, outright telling her plainly that money alone was never the point, and that what he truly wanted was for the house to be rebuilt in the exact same place to the same design, using materials equal to what had been destroyed. Marla mocked the request, certain that no court could force an association to physically rebuild a home that no longer existed and would instead be limited to paying fair market value. Tessa explained that when destruction is deliberate, when fraud and trespass are involved, Courts retain the authority to order equitable remedies that go well beyond a simple check, and she built Grant's case around three demands: full funding for reconstruction, comprehensive compensation for every loss suffered, and punitive damages severe enough to answer for deliberate, concealed wrongdoing. Independent contractors estimated the true cost of rebuilding at more than $4 million, a figure that didn't even account for the personal belongings that could never truly be replaced or the months Grant had already lost, being unable to use his own property. As the case tightened around her, Marla attempted to liquidate several association assets and move the proceeds into accounts tied to Summit Crest Holdings, prompting Tessa to request an immediate asset freeze, which the court granted along with a stern warning that any further attempt to move funds would be treated as contempt. The freeze order reached 3 separate bank accounts and a brokerage holding tied to Summit Crest Holdings, effectively cutting off Marla's ability to shield anything further before a verdict could be reached, and forcing her attorneys to spend the final weeks before trial defending her personal conduct, rather than expanding the clubhouse project she had once been so certain would succeed. The night before depositions were scheduled to begin, Ross informed Grant and Tessa that investigators had recovered a damning piece of audio from Celeste's phone, a recording in which Marla stated, with chilling confidence, that if the house disappeared quickly enough, the law would simply have no choice but to accept whatever had already been done. The trial opened before Judge Everett Sloan, a jurist known throughout the county for demanding precision and giving no quarter to evasive testimony in a courtroom filled well past capacity, with Silver Ridge residents eager to finally hear the truth laid out under oath. Sloan had presided over the county bench for more than 15 years, and lawyers who had appeared before him described a man who tolerated theatrics from no one, regardless of which side of the room they came from. The association's attorneys argued that Marla had acted in good faith, believing the home to be a genuine safety hazard, and tried repeatedly to separate her personal conduct from the association's collective liability, a strategy that began unraveling the moment the first witness took the prom stand. Tessa called Nolan Price first, and his testimony, backed by the certified survey map and county boundary records, made clear beyond any doubt that Grant's land had never belonged to Silver Ridge, a point reinforced when Tessa introduced his email, in which Marla had asked whether the boundary could be redrawn once the old structure was gone. Judith Crane testified next, describing precisely how her official stamp had been repurposed to suggest an approval that had never actually been granted, and the courtroom listened in silence as the recording of Marla's threat against her husband's contracts played aloud. Wade Mercer followed, walking the court through the demolition step by step and admitting under oath that he had never once seen an actual court order, only Marla's repeated assurances that one existed. When Tessa asked him directly whether he had ever laid eyes on a genuine judicial order authorizing the demolition, Wade answered simply that there had never been one to see, and the text messages projected onto the courtroom screen, including the line about leaving nothing intact enough to move back into, needed no further explanation. Celeste took the stand, visibly shaken, describing in detail how Marla had controlled the board-forged signatures when convenient and threatened to let her take the full blame if the scheme ever unraveled. Tessa entered the private ledger into evidence alongside the Summit Crest Holdings paperwork and the projected profit of $14,600,000 numbers that made the association's claim of pure safety concern almost impossible to defend with a straight face. Grant testified last among the primary witnesses, describing the house methodically, its restoration history, and why no simple market valuation could ever substitute for a home built with his own 2 hands, calmly rejecting the defense's attempt to suggest his insurance coverage made the destruction somehow less consequential. He spoke for nearly an hour, without once raising his voice, walking the jury through blueprint after blueprint, explaining materials and techniques that no longer existed in ordinary supply chains, and by the time he finished, several jurors were visibly moved by the quiet precision of a man who had clearly lost far more than square footage. When Marla finally took the stand, she insisted repeatedly that everything she had done was meant to protect the community, but her composure crumbled under cross-examination. Tessa asked her why a structure supposedly on the verge of collapse happened to be demolished at the exact moment its owner left town, and Marla claimed it was mere coincidence, until Tessa produced the internal association email listing, Grant's travel schedule. When shown architectural drawings for the clubhouse dated before the demolition permit had even been drafted, Marla again claimed she couldn't recall the details, and when the courtroom finally watched the recorded footage of her standing on the cleared hilltop, promising ownership before Grant could ever find a lawyer, the room fell completely silent. Judge Sloan looked directly at her and stated plainly that the question was no longer whether the house had been wrongly destroyed, but how deliberately and how completely the entire scheme had been calculated from the start. After weighing every piece of testimony and evidence, Judge Sloan concluded that the demolition had never been an administrative mistake, but a deliberate, coordinated campaign carried out through trespass, destruction of property, forged signatures, misuse of a fraudulent permit, theft from a private onesie safe, a fabricated boundary record, embezzlement of association funds, destruction of evidence, coercion of a public official, and a calculated attempt to profit from harm the defendants themselves had caused. When the association's counsel asked the court to limit damages strictly to the market value of the house before demolition, the judge rejected the argument outright, explaining that such a limit would effectively let a criminal scheme accomplish through destruction what it could never have achieved through an honest purchase. He noted from the bench that the law could not treat forced destruction the same as a voluntary sale, and that allowing a wrongdoer to simply pay the appraised value of what they destroyed would create an incentive for exactly this kind of scheme to spread to every property owner unwilling to sell on someone else's terms. The first order the judge issued was a full restitution mandate, requiring the association to hire an architect and structural engineer, approved directly by Grant, rebuild the home on its original foundation, using materials of equal or greater quality, restore the stone wall, the gate, the well, and the surrounding landscape, replace the workshop and the solar energy system, rebuild the garage, and compensate for the 2 vintage automobiles lost, and cover every cost tied to permitting design and oversight, all under a firm completion deadline with independent monthly progress reports and financial penalties accruing for every day of unjustified delay. Alongside the rebuilding order, the judge awarded Grant $10 million in total damages, covering the value of property and belongings that could never be recovered, the cost of temporary housing and lost use of his land professional, losses tied to destroyed equipment, the expense of investigation and expert testimony, the full weight of his legal fees, damages for the deliberate violation of his property rights, and a substantial punitive component reflecting the fraud and concealment behind the entire scheme, with the rebuilding costs calculated entirely separate from that figure rather than deducted from it. The judge further ordered the freezing of all Summit Crest Holdings assets, the cancellation of every clubhouse plan tied to the property, a permanent ban preventing Marla from ever holding a leadership position within any homeowners association again, referral of the forged records and missing funds to criminal prosecutors, appointment of an independent interim board to oversee Silver Ridge, and a multi-year audit of every association account going forward. Marla rose from her seat, insisting the association could never afford to comply with such an order, and the judge answered that financial hardship offered no excuse for an organization to keep the benefits of a scheme built on deliberate destruction. When she pressed further, he warned her plainly that continued outbursts would be treated as contempt of court. As bailiffs stepped toward her, Grant allowed himself one last look in her direction, and though the hilltop still sat empty that afternoon for the first time since his return, he knew with total certainty that his home was actually going to be rebuilt. Reconstruction began under the close supervision of an independent engineer, and Grant made it clear from the start that he had no interest in something larger or grander than what had been lost, only in seeing the house return as close to its original form as possible. Using 3-dimensional scans, archived footage, and the original blueprints, the construction team restored the stone facade, the sloped timber roof, the central fireplace, the workshop, the stone gate, the hillside garden, the well system, the garage, and the open view stretching out across the valley below. A handful of stones salvaged from the original rubble were cleaned and set back into the new fireplace, a quiet reminder that some part of the house had survived even the worst that had been done to it. The new association board sent Grant a formal letter of apology, which he accepted while still declining to join the association himself, insisting instead that the legal boundary separating his land from Silver Ridge be respected permanently going forward. Residents voted through a set of new bylaws designed to prevent anything like this from happening again, barring the destruction of property without a valid court order, requiring independent audits for any major expenditure, stripping the board president of unilateral contract approval, mandating county confirmation of any boundary claim, forcing public disclosure of conflicts of interest among board members, and requiring every property-related meeting to be formally documented. Celeste cooperated fully with prosecutors and accepted responsibility for her role in the scheme, while Wade lost his contractor's license for a period, but avoided far harsher consequences thanks to his cooperation and his help, recovering Grant's stolen property. Judith's testimony led the city to change its own procedures, ensuring a simple receipt stamp could never again be mistaken for genuine approval. And city officials publicly credited her courage in coming forward for exposing a gap in the permitting process that had likely been quietly exploited before, though never on a scale this severe. Wade eventually rebuilt his business under strict internal policies, refusing any job in the future without a verified court order in hand, a lesson he said he would carry for the rest of his career. Marla herself faced a separate criminal prosecution on charges, including forgery, theft, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice, and Summit Crest Holdings was formally dissolved, its remaining assets seized to help satisfy the judgment against her. Months later, the house stood finished its stone walls, catching the late afternoon light the same way they had for years before the demolition, as though the hillside itself had simply been waiting for its shape to return. On the day Grant received the keys, there was no celebration, no gathering of neighbors or reporters, only a quiet walk through each room as he checked every joint and beam with the same care he had once brought to bridges built to hold the weight of thousands. He ran his hand along the new mantel, tested the give of the floorboards near the entryway, and stood for a long while at the window overlooking the valley, the same view that had once made this hilltop worth destroying a home to obtain. He paused longest at the rebuilt fireplace, where he later placed a small frame display near the front door containing the original survey map, a copy of the court's judgment, and one twisted piece of metal pulled from the wreckage of his old home. Beneath a single line reading that power does not create ownership, forged paper does not create truth, and destroying a house can never destroy the right of the person who owns it. Standing on the porch of his rebuilt home, Grant looked out over Silver Ridge, where a clubhouse had once been planned to rise in his absence, and where his untouched land now stood instead, every stone and pathway restored exactly as it should have remained from the start. His victory had come not from revenge or confrontation, but from the simple discipline of preserving evidence, and refusing to let those who abused their power escape the consequences of the law. A lesson every resident of Silver Ridge would carry with them long after the courtroom doors had closed for the final time. The clubhouse that was meant to rise on his hilltop existed now only in discarded blueprints, buried somewhere in a case file, while the home that had once been reduced to rubble stood taller and steadier than it had ever stood before. Marla had believed that 7 days away was enough time to erase Grant Hollis and his house from the hill forever, but in the end, it was the court's ruling that erased her power for good, leaving nothing standing where her ambition once stood so tall.